So she had an amazing ability to be the very embodiment of Gael and Irish, and at the same time able to talk and deal with the foreigner, the English, the Normans, in a way that was extremely successful. She must have been extremely charismatic. And one of the stories about her going to meet the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, as you probably know, Ireland was run as it was a separate kingdom, but the English king sent over we don't call them lieutenants, we call them lieutenants. A lieutenant, in other words, a deputy. And there's a great story of the Lord Lieutenant, his name was Perot, visiting Galway, and it was a big occasion when somebody like that came down and held court, if you like, and it was almost like the Queen himself, the King himself coming. And for whatever reason, he wanted to meet Gráinne. He wanted to meet Gráinne, and she came into Galway with her entourage of galleys. And of course, they would be very curious for the British. The British would be very curious to see them up close and to actually mix with them. And in typical fashion, Gráinne Mhaol, having been entertained, if you like, at the local castle, offered the Lord Lieutenant a ride on her boat. And she took him out for a trip around the harbour. And very much against the advice of his generals and military, who were horrified at the idea of him going off with her. But he was enthralled with her. And of course she was perfectly safe, or he was perfectly safe, because that wasn't her style. She wouldn't do that. But you can see how clever she was, her political acumen. She was getting to know this man. She was making sure that he got to know her, and that they had a personal relationship and a respectful relationship, which of course paid off several times afterwards, in that she would go directly to somebody like him and appeal to him as a fellow aristocrat almost, in that she could speak to these people on their own level and reason with them. You see, so I just give that as an example of the kind of woman that she was. She was not a wild, crazy woman out there leading a bunch of cutthroats that may or may not be what they're going to portray in I haven't seen it. I would love to see it, the musical. But the truth about her is a lot more complex. And of course, it was perfectly natural for her in later years, when she was almost on the ropes by this guy Bingham, who was an extraordinary capable but incredibly brutal soldier. And for her to have gone up against him and to have survived him, nobody else ever succeeded in doing it in Ireland. I don't know, before or since, has anybody ever been able to outwit somebody as powerful as Richard Bingham. And I'll just very quickly give you an idea who he is. And by the way, the Bingham family still survive to this day as the Earls of Lucan. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the missing Earl. You did? Somebody's nodding their heads. Yeah, about, I don't know, it must be near 20 years ago now, that there was a very famous, it was kind of like the Nicole, what do you call it thing? That, God, I can't even switch on CNN. Why do they, there was a cartoon saying, yeah, they have overdosed. CNN line dead like that, they'd overdose on Nicole. Anyway, there was a big scandal in Mayfair in London about 20 odd years ago, where the chief suspect in a very nasty murder where an au pair girl was killed, and it turned out that it was the actual Earl that had killed, because he meant to kill his wife, only that the au pair looked exactly like him or like her, and he snuck into the room. I mean, it would have made one of these great Hollywood movies like Dial M for Murder or whatever. Well, he he was pretty well, they had him cold, but he was literally snuck out of the country. And that's a scandal in itself, in that because he was so high up in the aristocracy in Britain, that probably the government itself and the royal family and what have you snuck him out, maybe on board an RAF plane or whatever to God knows where, Argentina or whatever. And he's probably still at large because he was a relatively young man. Anyway, he's the current Earl of Lucan, and that is the title that the Bingham family later adopted, and all in the west of Ireland, by the way. Anyway, the Bingham family goes all the way back to the 1066 to the conquest of England by William the Conqueror, and apparently one of his best generals or fighting men or knights was Sir Richard Bingham. The name Richard survived down through the years. So he came, and prior to that, he would have been, that Bingham and that family would have been one of the warrior class, if you like. So it was in the blood. He was really a warrior class. Like I'm not sure what you'd compare to him. We don't have anything quite like that in America. And if he hadn't died in 1599, those of you who know a little about the Battle of Kinsale, he would almost certainly have been, and had been until he died actually, would have been the one who would have been in charge of the British forces, the English forces in Ireland, not Lord Mountjoy. Lord Mountjoy was one of his lieutenants. So when Bingham died, and he actually died after just coming back to Ireland, Queen Elizabeth, Lord Cecil, Walsingham, all of those guys that you're probably familiar with if you've ever seen any of the movies on Elizabeth I, that court that she had, very powerful men, they sent Bingham back because there was a danger that the Spanish were going to land again in Ireland, and that O'Neill had turned rebel, and so they sent him back to straighten it out. But he died shortly after arriving in Dublin, and in those days people just died. They get something, whatever, and he was maybe, I'm not sure, he certainly would be in his 60s, but probably the best that the British had. Well, anyway, for her to have managed to keep her lands against him was an extraordinary thing. And by the way, it was to petition against him. It was to plead with Elizabeth herself to protect her from this guy that she went to England. So I guess I'm saying here that this woman was and that's obviously one of the reasons why Elizabeth really liked her and took to her, because she had such courage, both physical and moral courage, and was obviously so bright, and obviously very, very capable. So I'm sure Elizabeth would have loved to have had her by her side, because the two of them were very, very politically clever. Anyway, when she, getting back to when as a young girl she was sent off extremely reluctantly. I mean, she was just madder than a wet hen when she was sent down to marry this guy Donal Cogga O'Flaherty down in Galway. It's just like over the next range of mountains in the next hill, the O'Flahertys. But the O'Flahertys were they were wild, still are to this day. There was something wild about them. They really were. It does run in the genes, there's no doubt, of long periods. And they were. Is there a Flaherty in here? No, I'm Flannery. I'm not Flaherty. But the idea of going down and living with and marrying to one of the O'Flahertys, and particularly the guy Donal that she was going to marry, which was Donal Cogga, which means Donal of the fights. Cogga is wars, you know what I mean? Like that's all he ever wanted to do, was go to war. So he was on his horse all the time, off fighting with somebody. he was just he reveled in it, and but she did her duty to her father, and she married the guy, went down and lived in Bunanoan. The castle is still there, and had 3 kids with him. Until he got himself killed, inevitably. And then she returned back to Clare Island again on her own, and brought her 3 kids with her. But she had earned the undying respect of the O'Flahertys.